This is Conrad Heyer, the oldest known person whose face was ever captured by photography. He was born in 1749 in Maine, then still a British colony, as a subject of King George II. During his youth, other figures born in the 17th century were still alive: Johann Sebastian Bach, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. The ideas of Voltaire and Montesquieu had a profound influence on the American Revolution, in which Heyer himself took part. As a soldier of the Continental Army, he marched with Washington, and according to tradition stood among those who in December 1776 crossed the frozen Delaware and brought victory at Trenton. Another participant in the War of Independence, Samuel Downing, left this testimony in an interview given in 1864. "We were right opposite Washington's headquarters. I saw him every day. Was he as fine a looking man as he is reported to have been? Oh! But you never got a smile out of him. He was a nice man. We loved him. They'd sell their lives for him. What do you think he would say if he was here now? How would Washington treat traitors if he caught them? Hang them to the first tree." Another participant in the War of Independence, Alexander Milliner, was too young at the time of his enlistment for service in the ranks. He was enlisted as drummer boy, and in this capacity he served 4 years, in Washington's Life Guard. He was a great favorite, he says, with the commander-in-chief, who used frequently, after the beating of the reveille, to come along and pat him on the head, and call him his boy. On one occasion, a bitter cold morning, he gave him a drink out of his flask. His recollection of Washington is distinct and vivid. He was a good man, a beautiful man. He was always pleasant, never changed countenance, but wore the same in defeat and retreat as in victory. Lady Washington, too, he recollects, on her visits to the camp. She was a short, thick woman, very pleasant and kind. She used to visit the hospitals, was kind-hearted, and had a motherly care. One day the general had been out some time. When he came in, his wife asked him where he had been. He answered, laughing, "To look at my boys." "Well," said she, "I will go and see my children." Among the first politicians of the new republic was Albert Gallatin, who was present in Philadelphia as early as 1787, when the United States Constitution was signed. Later, as Secretary of the Treasury, he became the architect of financial stability for the young republic, and a determined opponent of Alexander Hamilton in shaping America's financial system. But the nation also faced threats on its frontiers. In 1794, the Northwest Indian War culminated in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Hugh Brady fought there under General Anthony Wayne and began his long military career. William Henry Harrison, also present at Fallen Timbers, gained further fame in 1811. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, Harrison defeated the warriors of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. These frontier wars were already supported by Britain, through weapons and supplies from Canada. When the United States entered the War of 1812 against Britain, native allies once again stood on its side. In Congress, the loudest advocate for war with Britain was Henry Clay, leader of the War Hawks. On the opposite side stood John Quincy Adams. In 1814 he became the chief negotiator at Ghent, where he secured the treaty that ended the war. The war also brought forth acts of civilian courage. When British troops set fire to the White House in 1814, First Lady Dolly Madison saved precious state documents and the portrait of George Washington. In this task she was assisted by Paul Jennings, a young enslaved servant in the Madison household. On the battlefield, new heroes emerged. Andrew Jackson became a national figure after his victories over the Creek at Horseshoe Bend, and above all, his triumph at New Orleans. Winfield Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, earned lasting fame at the battles of Chippewa and Lundy's Lane with his disciplined brigade. Lewis Cass, governor of Michigan, became a symbol of the vulnerable Northwest frontier after the loss of Detroit. On the British side, Canadian troops fought along with warriors of the Six Nations. The photograph shows John Smoke Johnson, John Tutela, and young Warner. Veterans of these battles continued to gather long after the war had ended. the memory of the War of 1812 endured for a century. In 1905, when the last known American veteran, Hiram Cronk, died at the age of 105, the nation marked his passing with a public funeral in New York. In that ceremony, the present met the distant past one final time. The ideas of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers also found fertile ground in France. They gained supporters even among the highest aristocracy, including the 16-year-old Prince Louis-Philippe of Orleans, the future king of the French. His father, the Duke of Orleans, had already in the early 1780s opened the gardens of the Palais Royal to the public. Ladies and gentlemen strolled beneath the arcades, cafes buzzed with discussion, gambling houses drew crowds, and in the shade of the trees, a new public opinion was taking shape. It was here, on July 12, 1789, that Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a table in front of the Café de Foy. He called on the people to take up arms, and the crowd responded. 2 days later, the revolutionary wave swept through the streets. On July 14, the Bastille fell. Just 3 days after that event, on July 17, 1789, Louis XVI entered Paris. In Howell's watercolor we see him before the Louvre, right next to the Palais Royal, where young Louis-Philippe lived at the time. 3 years later, in 1792, he was already taking part in the Revolutionary Wars. At Valmy, the young prince stood with the citizen army that halted the Prussian advance, a battle that became the symbolic birth of the French Republic.
Yes, I can tell you something about my grandfather. He was born in the early years of the French Revolution. He was a member of Parliament while Napoleon was still on the throne. In common with all the Whig followers of Fox, he thought English hostility to Napoleon was excessive, and he visited Napoleon in Elba.
In December 1814, John Russell, grandfather of the philosopher Bertrand Russell, visited Napoleon in exile on the island of Elba. Soon afterward, Napoleon escaped and tried once more to regain power in France. Loyal veterans such as Thierry, Delignan, Mayer, and Dussel rallied to his side. But in June 1815, at Waterloo, he was defeated by the Duke of Wellington, and his power was broken forever. Life in France continued after the fall of Napoleon, and a new art began to develop, photography. In this early image from 1826, Joseph Nicephore Niepce captured the view from his window onto the French countryside. A decade later, in 1838, Louis Daguerre photographed a Paris boulevard. Because the exposure lasted many minutes, the busy street appears empty, only a shoeshiner and his customer stood still long enough to be recorded. In a later photograph of the same place that afternoon, even they are gone. Rebecca Felton, born in 1835 in Georgia, recalls her childhood.
I was a 3-year-old girl when the Indians were moved from this country to Indian Territory. I have an indistinct recollection of seeing the red men as they went through the woods, for everything was woods nearly at that time. I have a distinct impression, if a 3-year-old child can have it. Nevertheless, I've been here since that time, and I've seen the march of progress all the way. At that time, we had only stagecoaches, and we only had horses and buggies, and we had lots of footback travelers.
What she as a 3-year-old saw in 1838 was the beginning of the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Native American tribes from the eastern side of the Mississippi, for example from Georgia, to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. This expulsion remains one of the most tragic chapters of American history. Yet, despite this tragedy, progress in the United States gradually advanced, especially during the presidency of James Polk, who took office in 1845. In a photograph from 1846 we see him with his wife in front of the White House, and to his right stands the former First Lady Dolly Madison. Polk pursued an expansionist policy and entered into war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. American soldiers pushed deep into Mexican territory, as we can see in the photograph where they are entering the city of Saltillo. The result of the Mexican-American War was the acquisition of vast lands, present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and parts of Colorado, Utah, and Texas, which fundamentally reshaped the face of the United States. Among the first American settlers who colonized the newly acquired Mexican territories were the Mormons. Their fourth leader, Wilford Woodruff, in 1897 said,
"And now by testimony that in the early spring of 1844, in all room as on the 25th fall, the 12 apostles together have been delivered unto them the ordinances of the church kingdom of God, and all the keys and powers that God has bestowed upon him to seal upon our heads. He told us we must round up our shoulders and bear off this kingdom all we would began."
The Mormons decided in 1847 to establish Smith's Heavenly Kingdom at the Great Salt Lake in Utah, where they founded their new center. We can see the photograph from 1897 of Mormon pioneers at the 50th anniversary celebration, including some who had taken part in the very first journey west. When they first moved west, they believed they were entering Mexican territory, but in fact they were already within the United States, as a result of the Mexican-American War. Another photograph, taken in 1853, shows the Cheyenne by the Platte River with their teepees. The expeditions of settlers, among them the Mormons, traveled westward along this very river, passing Native Americans like those we see here. Another great impulse for the movement westward was the discovery of gold in California in 1848. In San Francisco, the harbor filled with hundreds of abandoned ships, vessels deserted by their crews as sailors rushed inland in search of fortune. Few ever became rich from gold itself, yet the gold rush left a lasting mark. It drew settlers west, built new towns, and helped to populate the Pacific frontier. At the beginning of the 1840s, much of Europe still lived under forms of feudalism little different from the Middle Ages. Here we see the Kotek family from the Austrian Empire in 1841. At the lower right, the 12-year-old Bohuslav Kotek, later the father of Sophie Kotek, who would be assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. Like many aristocratic families, the Koteks still owned serfs, just as in medieval times. From Brno we see the Corpus Christi procession of 1841. These inhabitants of the Austrian Empire were still subjects of the emperor, without civil rights. In northern Europe, the Great Hamburg Fire of 1842 left ruins behind. At that time Hamburg was still a free Hanseatic city, independent within the German Confederation, where civic rights were limited but real. Across most of Europe, however, true freedoms were rare, found above all in Britain and France. In Rome, too, subjects remained under the temporal rule of the papacy. This photograph shows Pope Gregory XVI giving the Urbi et Orbi blessing on Holy Thursday, 1842, in St. Peter's Square. But change was coming. In 1848, the wave of revolution began in Paris. Barricades appeared in the streets, the king abdicated, and within weeks the flames of revolt spread across Europe. The upheaval was first captured by Thibaut's daguerreotype. We see the deserted streets and barricades at the start of the June days. A second photograph shows the aftermath, with soldiers in the same streets, the barricades broken. In London, too, unrest rose. This image shows the vast Chartist demonstration on Kennington Common. In Budapest, the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 succeeded in abolishing serfdom, but its second goal, independence from Austria, was not achieved. The leader of the uprising, Lajos Kossuth, was forced into exile for decades. From abroad he could send only greetings to his homeland. In the mid-19th century, the greatest European power was Britain, ruled by Queen Victoria. Here she appears with her daughter, Princess Victoria, the future mother of the German Emperor Wilhelm II. In London, construction was transforming the city. This image shows Nelson's column rising on Trafalgar Square in 1843. Across Britain, new ships were being built. The Great Britain, launched in 1843, was the first ocean-going vessel with an iron hull and a screw propeller, setting the model for modern shipping. Britain also sent expeditions into unknown regions. In 1845 Sir John Franklin sailed to seek the Northwest Passage. By 1848 his expedition was lost in the Arctic, never to return. Empire meant war as well as exploration. In India, the Second Anglo-Sikh War brought the Punjab under British control. Captured Sikh guns are seen here in 1849. Further east, the Second Anglo-Burmese War of 1852 extended British power into Burma. The high point of Britain's self-confidence came in 1851 with the opening of the Great Exhibition. Housed in the vast Crystal Palace, built entirely of glass and iron, it displayed the industrial and imperial achievements of the Victorian age to the world. The greatest military action of Britain in this era was the Crimean War. Fought from 1853 to 1856, it pitted Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, in a struggle over influence in the Black Sea and the fate of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Here we see Balaclava, the small harbor where British ships unloaded supplies. Nearby, on these barren hills, armies set up vast camps, awaiting battle. On October 25, 1854, Balaclava became the scene of one of the most famous charges in history, the attack of the Light Brigade. Cornet Louis Launfried sounded the trumpet call to advance.
I am Trumpeter Lanfrid, one of the surviving trumpeters in charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. I am now going to sound the bugle that was sounded at Waterloo and sound the charge that was sounded at Balaclava on that very same bugle.
Like many others in the brigade, he was wounded, and evacuated across the Black Sea to the military hospital in Scutari, near Istanbul. It was there that Florence Nightingale arrived. Shocked by the terrible conditions, where most soldiers died not of their wounds but of infection, she transformed military nursing, introducing strict hygiene and care. Her reforms saved thousands of lives and shaped modern medicine.
I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. God bless my dear old comrades of Balaclava and bring them safe to shore. Florence Nightingale.